At around 8 o'clock in the evening on April 4th, 2026, a small dinghy left shore in the Bahamas, carrying two people who had spent decades together. Only one of them would make it back. What happened in the dark waters between Hopetown and their yacht is now the center of an active international investigation. And as cadaver dogs are brought in, the focus of that search appears to be changing. By the end of this video, you will understand what is known, what investigators are quietly questioning, and why this case is no longer being treated as a simple accident. Everything in this video comes from verified reports and statements from authorities and individuals directly involved in the case. Where details remain unclear, that uncertainty is acknowledged. Now here's what matters. Lynette Hooker was 55 years old, a lifelong traveler. She had spent years living at sea with her husband, Brian Hooker. They were not inexperienced. They had been sailing the Caribbean for over a decade, moving from island to island on their yacht. So when investigators first heard what allegedly happened that night, it raised immediate questions. According to Brian Hooker, the couple had gone ashore near Hopetown in the Abaco Islands. Later that evening, they boarded a small dinghy to return to their main boat. Somewhere during that short trip, in worsening weather conditions, Lynette went overboard. That is the official account he gave to authorities. He says the conditions were rough. He says she fell. He says he could not get her back. And then, according to his statement, things got worse. He claimed that the dinghy became difficult to control, and he eventually had to make his way back alone to get help. Now think about that for a moment. This was not open ocean travel. This was a relatively short distance between shore and a yacht, a route they would have taken before, possibly many times. So investigators had to reconstruct exactly what happened in that narrow window. This is where the timeline becomes critical. Lynette Hooker is believed to have gone overboard on the evening of April 4th. But Brian Hooker did not reach help immediately. Authorities later confirmed that he was taken into custody on April 8th for questioning. That alone does not prove anything. In cases like this, especially when one person is missing and the only witness is a spouse, questioning is standard procedure. But the fact that he was detained tells you something important. Investigators did not immediately accept the explanation. They needed to verify it. He was held, questioned, and then released without charges several days later. And that detail matters just as much because it tells us two things at the same time. First, there was not enough evidence to formally charge him. Second, the investigation was far from over. Now, before we continue, I want to ask you something. Based on what you've heard so far, does this sound like a straightforward accident? Or does something feel like it's not fully adding up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them because sometimes viewers notice details that even early investigations circle back to later. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe. Because my next update is where the physical evidence and water conditions start to challenge the story in a very different way. Now let's continue. Search and rescue efforts initially focused on the water. That is what you would expect if someone falls overboard. But as days passed, the search expanded. The operation began to include shoreline patrols, aerial surveillance, and underwater searches using drones. And then came a very specific decision. Cadaver dogs were brought in to assist with the search. This is where things change. Cadaver dogs are not used for rescue. They are used for recovery. They are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition, even in challenging environments like water or buried terrain. So when those dogs are deployed, it signals a shift in how authorities are approaching the case. It does not confirm a crime, but it does suggest that investigators are preparing for a different outcome. Now consider the timing. The dogs were brought in more than a week after Lynette disappeared. That delay is significant. In the early stages, the focus is always on survival, but after several days, with no confirmed sightings and no recovery, the strategy changes. And that is exactly what we are seeing here. Meanwhile, Brian Hooker remained in the Bahamas for a period of time after his release. In interviews, he said his only focus was finding his wife, no matter how likely or unlikely that outcome might be. He also expressed regret. He said he would always believe there was something he could have done differently. Those are emotional statements, but investigators do not rely on emotion. They rely on consistency. And that brings us to one of the central questions in this case. Does the timeline, the environment, and the physical evidence support the account that has been given? Because when someone falls overboard, especially in a small vessel, there are expected patterns. Search grids are calculated based on wind, current, and drift. Objects in the water tend to move in predictable ways, and in many cases, something is found. Clothing, equipment, a body. So far, in this case, that has not happened, and that absence becomes part of the evidence, not proof of wrongdoing, but something investigators have to explain. Now, here's another detail that adds pressure to the situation. Brian Hooker's attorney limited what he could publicly say about the incident. That usually indicates an ongoing investigation where statements could carry legal consequences. At the same time, authorities have not ruled anything out, and that includes the possibility that this was not simply an accident. So where does that leave us? At this point in the investigation, there are two parallel tracks. One is the official search effort, now expanded and supported by specialized tools like cadaver dogs. The other is the ongoing analysis of what happened that night. Those two tracks do not always move at the same pace, but they do influence each other because every new piece of evidence, or the absence of it, shapes the direction of the case. And right now, the introduction of cadaver dogs suggests that investigators are preparing for a different kind of answer than the one first given. We are going to look closely at the physical realities of that night, the conditions, the mechanics of a fall overboard, and whether the explanation provided actually aligns with what experts say should have happened. Because once you understand that, the case begins to look very different. Now we need to slow this down and look at something investigators always return to in cases like this. Not speculation, not emotion, but physical reality. Because the question is no longer just what was said happened, but whether it could have happened the way it was described. Start with the environment that night. The area around Hopetown is coastal water, not deep open ocean. That matters because coastal waters behave differently. Currents are more predictable. Movement is easier to model. And distances between shore and anchored boats are relatively short. Investigators can reconstruct that environment with surprising accuracy. Wind direction, tide movement, wave height, visibility. All of it feeds into what is called a drift analysis. Now here's why that matters. If someone enters the water at a known point in time, experts can estimate where they should be minutes, hours, and even days later. It is not perfect, but it is consistent enough to challenge or support an account. So when investigators looked at what was described that night, they were not just listening to the story, they were testing it against physics. Now consider the moment of the fall itself. According to the account, Lynette went overboard during the return trip in a small dinghy. That kind of vessel is low, open, and unstable compared to larger boats. So yes, a fall is possible, but in real-world cases, experts say something important almost always happens in that moment. There is immediate awareness, a sound, a movement, a reaction from the person still inside the boat. Because distance is minimal, there is no delay in noticing what happened. And that creates a very short window where response is possible, even if conditions are poor, even if visibility is low. Now here's the critical point investigators focus on. What happened immediately after the fall? Because in most overboard incidents, even if rescue fails, there are usually traces of an attempt. A turned boat, a flotation item thrown, a second pass over the area, something that shows reaction. That reaction becomes part of the physical story. But in this case, investigators are still working to match that expected pattern with what has been described. Now let's talk about conditions. Reports from that night suggest weather was not calm, but also not extreme storm-level conditions. That distinction is important because rough seas can absolutely cause instability, but moderate conditions alone usually do not fully explain a complete loss of control in a short coastal route between shore and yacht. So investigators begin comparing two things side by side: what was said happened, and what the environment actually supports. This is where small inconsistencies become important, not because they prove anything on their own, but because they build pressure in the overall timeline. Now move forward to time. Every maritime case depends heavily on timing, the moment the incident occurs. The moment it is reported and the gap between those 2 points, because even a short delay changes everything. Search areas expand, drift predictions weaken, and accuracy decreases. In this case, investigators have focused closely on that timeline, not as a conclusion, but as a factor that affects every other part of the investigation. Now here's another layer: water survival. When someone falls into the ocean unexpectedly, the body reacts immediately. Shock, breathing changes, disorientation. Even experienced swimmers can struggle in the first moments. That part of the scenario is medically realistic, but survival time and visibility are still influenced by conditions like temperature, clothing, and wave movement. So investigators have to consider whether someone could disappear from view as quickly as described, and whether that disappearance aligns with search results that followed, because searches were conducted. Extensive ones, surface scans, aerial observation, grid patterns based on drift models, and still, there has been no confirmed recovery, no physical item clearly linked to the exact point of entry, and that absence becomes part of the analysis, not as proof, but as something that has to be explained. Now here's where expert review often enters cases like this. When standard search efforts do not produce expected results, investigators and specialists often revisit the original assumptions. Was the entry point correct? Was the timing accurate? Was the environment fully understood at the moment the search began? Because if any of those inputs are slightly off, the entire model shifts and the outcome changes. That is why cases like this can remain open even after extensive search efforts, because the system depends on accurate starting conditions, and right now, those conditions are still being examined. So where does this leave the investigation? At a point where the physical explanation is being tested against what should have happened. Not what might have happened, but what the laws of movement, time, and environment suggest should have happened under those conditions. And if there is alignment, then the case remains within the boundaries of a tragic accident. But if there is a gap, then investigators have to explain why that gap exists. And that is exactly where attention is now shifting. Now we are going to move away from physics and into behavior, the human decisions before and after the incident, the statements given, and the subtle details investigators often rely on when physical evidence is limited, because when the water does not fully answer the question, people often become the focus. At this stage, the investigation moves into its most sensitive area, because when physical evidence does not give a clear answer, investigators focus on something else. Human behavior, not emotion, not opinion, but patterns. What was said, what was done, and whether the two align over time. Now start with what is confirmed. Brian Hooker was the last known person to be with Lynette before she disappeared. That places him at the center of the timeline, not as a conclusion of wrongdoing, but as the starting point for reconstruction. Investigators always begin here, because in any missing person case where there are no witnesses, the final known contact becomes critical. Now look at his account. He has maintained that Lynette went overboard during the return trip in the dinghy. He has described difficult conditions. He has said he was unable to recover her, and he has consistently maintained that it was an accident. That consistency is important because when someone repeats the same core explanation over time, it becomes a stable reference point in the investigation. But investigators do not stop at the statement itself. They examine what happened next, how quickly the situation was reported, what actions were taken immediately afterward, and whether those actions match expected behavior in an emergency at sea. Now, in most overboard situations, the priority is immediate recovery, turning the vessel, returning to the exact location, alerting nearby help as quickly as possible. Every minute matters, so investigators examine the gap between the incident and when authorities were contacted, not to assume wrongdoing, but to understand how that gap affected search accuracy and response time, because even small delays in maritime cases can significantly reduce recovery chances. Now here is where things become more complicated. Brian Hooker was later detained for questioning before being released without charges. That fact alone does not indicate guilt, but it does show that investigators felt the need to closely examine his account and test it against physical findings. That is standard procedure when one person remains and another is missing. Now consider behavior after release. According to statements, he remained focused on the search for Lynette. He expressed emotional distress. He said he regretted aspects of what happened that night. Those are human reactions, but investigators are not evaluating emotion. They are evaluating consistency between action and circumstance. Now, this is where the investigation becomes layered, because there is no independent witness, no confirmed external account of what happened inside that dinghy. Everything begins with one version of events, and that means the entire case depends on whether that version can be supported or challenged by other evidence, physical or behavioral. Now bring back the search operation. As days passed without recovery, authorities expanded their efforts. Shoreline searches, aerial scanning, underwater searches using advanced equipment, and eventually the involvement of cadaver dogs. This decision is one of the clearest indicators of how the investigation is evolving, because cadaver dogs are not used in early rescue phases. They are introduced when the focus shifts toward recovery rather than survival. That shift does not confirm a crime, but it changes the direction of the investigation. Now, when those dogs are deployed, they are usually guided by refined search zones, areas determined through drift analysis, environmental modeling, and reassessment of initial reports, which means investigators are not just searching broadly anymore. They are narrowing in, based on updated understanding of where the incident likely occurred. Now, here is the critical point. If the original timeline or location is inaccurate, even slightly, it affects every downstream result: search accuracy, recovery probability, and interpretation of evidence absence. That is why investigators revisit initial statements repeatedly, not because they assume deception, but because accuracy determines outcome. Now, at this stage, there are still two possible frameworks. One is a tragic accident at sea where conditions and timing led to an unrecoverable situation. The other is a sequence of events that has not yet been fully reconstructed. And investigators are working carefully between those two possibilities without committing to either, because at this point there is no confirmed recovery, no definitive physical conclusion, and no publicly released final determination. So the case remains open, but not unchanged, because every new step in the search adds weight to one direction or another. And right now, the introduction of recovery-focused methods suggests investigators are preparing for outcomes that go beyond the initial explanation. Now, step back for a moment. When you strip away assumptions, what remains is simple: a short trip, a sudden incident, and a timeline that still has unanswered gaps. And those gaps are exactly what investigators are trying to close, not with speculation, but with evidence. So the question now becomes this: does the full sequence of events, from departure to disappearance, hold together under scrutiny, or are there missing pieces that still need to be explained? Because until that is resolved, the case remains open, and the search continues.